What's the ruling on one learning the maqamat and applying them to the recitation of the Quran? Naturally, beautifying one's voice in accordance with the rules of the qira'at and tajweed, in accordance with the rules of the pronunciation, the sifat and makharij of al-huruf, beautifying one's voice naturally in a way that prompts one to soften his heart and the hearts of those listening, and it gets his heart and the hearts of those listening to ponder and reflect upon the Quran and feel khushu'. That's no doubt recommended, and that's the meaning of the hadith that's in Sahih Bukhari. لَيْسَ مِنَّا مَنْ لَمْ يَتَغَنَّ بِالْقُرْآنِ. He's not one of us who doesn't beautify his voice when he recites the Quran. In order to answer this question, one must understand what maqamat are. Here in the question he says, what's the ruling on learning the maqamat? What he should have added is, what's the ruling on one learning the musical maqamat and applying them to the recitation of the Quran? Because they're musical maqamat. Al-maqamat al-musiqiyya. That's what they really are. Musical maqamat, as it pertains to the Quran, is applying musical rhythms to the recitation of the Quran. Applying musical rules to the recitation of the Quran. Pay attention to that definition. Listen to it closely. Applying musical rules to the recitation of the Quran. Because if you know that definition, you'll see how despicable that sounds. Applying musical rhythms or tunes to the recitation of the Quran. That right there should tell you all you need to know. Musical maqamat are specific rhythms and developed tunes that are used for entertainment by musicians and singers like al-Bayyat, al-Nahawand, al-Sabah, al-Sika. They're maqamat and rhythms based on the rules of music. The Quran is mightier than to be combined or attached in any way to that which is attached to music. And it's not something new. It's not a new science. This matter was actually discussed by the ulama of earlier centuries, because this science was known from possibly, wallahu alam, even before the revelation of the Quran. If the recitation with the maqamat, the musical maqamat, is taken away from the proper recitation of the Quran, and it's going against the established rules of recitation, if it's changing the way the Quran should be recited, adding or taking away anything in order to make it fit the rules of music, whether it pertains to the sifat or makharij of the huruf or tajweed or anything similar to that, there's no dispute among the ulama that it's haram. It's haram to listen to it, and it's haram to recite it. Let me give you an example. For certain musical maqamat, they do certain waves or pitches or vibrations in the mad of the alif. In order to comply with that musical maqam, the vocal dancing or vocal pitch with the mad on the alif makes that one alif 4 alifs. They've added 3 letters to the Quran. That's one problem. So now you have 4 alifs. Each alif gets 2 mads. That's a total of 8 harakat. Which mad has 8 harakat? If laymen or even students of knowledge who are not experts in the field of recitation were to hear how the majority of them tamper with the recitation of the Quran, they probably wouldn't be able to identify or recognize those errors. Some words of the Quran are recited when applying the maqamat, the musical maqamat. They're changed so much that if someone was to give an oath by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that those words that they mention are not from the Quran due to their altering of that word to fit the maqamat, they would be truthful. The one who gave the oath would be truthful. Ibn al-Qayyim said properly beautifying the voice with rhythms should be natural, with no exaggeration, and without any training in the maqamat. He said the Salaf despised and criticized and disparaged and condemned and forbade reading with those rhythms. They disapproved reading with them. And in response to those who claim the Salaf allowed it, he said everyone who knows the Salaf knows with certainty that the Salaf are free from that. And they disavow themselves from reciting the Quran in the musical maqamat or musical rhythms. The Salaf had nothing to do with learning or performing musical maqamat when reciting the Quran. Everyone knows how pious the Salaf were. They were too pious and too fearful of Allah to recite in accordance with those musical rhythms, or to even allow it. In fact, it was narrated by Al-A'mash that Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anh hated it. The Quran should be protected and respected. It has its own distinct, supreme rules, its own way of recitation. The Quran came beautiful from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with its own rules as it was revealed to the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam and as Jibreel taught it to the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam. It doesn't need no one to beautify it. Many of the teachers or experts who teach how to apply the maqamat to the Quran appear like musical entertainers or performers. You see them teaching the Quran, wal-'iyadhu billah, with the maqamat, like conductors in front of an orchestra or a choir. A new student of ours who just returned from studying those maqamat, after I strongly deterred him from that, he told me in classes the teacher would frequently reference music and musicians, and he would even play music for them to get a rhythm to apply it. Some countries stipulate that their official Quran reciters in their media need certificates from music academies before they can be considered or accepted. Some reciters openly admit they formally learn music as part of their training in reciting the Quran according to the maqamat. That's why it's not unusual for you to see reciters mention their love of musicians and that they listen to some famous singers in some of their interviews. The reaction of those listening to the famous reciters who recite in the maqamat take the disrespect of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even further than that. Is the shouts and reaction of the audience who listen to those reciters who recite based on the maqamat in accordance with the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَإِذَا قُرِئَ الْقُرْآنُ فَاسْتَمِعُوا لَهُ وَأَنصِتُوا لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ. The Quran is recited, it should be listened to. One should listen to it silently so he can attain the mercy of Allah. Some even hum the musical maqamat while the reciter is reciting, or while he takes those short breaks. A brother told me that some reciters pay a group to encourage that. It's gotten to a point where people uncontrollably make hysterical or sudden dance moves instead of listening with khushu' to attain the sweetness of the Quran. A very famous reciter who was reciting to a large audience, possibly, wallahu alam, in a funeral. He made a sudden dance move while he was reciting, وَلَوْ بَسَطَ اللَّهُ الرِّزْقَ لِعِبَادِهِ لَبَغَوْا فِي الْأَرْضِ. Then he apologized after he was banned for 6 or 12 months. And he said, I couldn't control myself. Because music, musical rhythms inspire dancing. The Quran recited properly, as Jibreel taught Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, it inspires one to contemplate, and it increases one's faith and fear of Allah, and it increases his khushu', and it guides one to deeds. It softens the heart and causes the skin to shiver. إنما المؤمنون الذين إذا ذكر الله وجلت قلوبهم وَإِذَا تُلِيَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتُهُ زَادَتْهُمْ إِيمَانًا. In the other verse, الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم وقلوبهم إلى ذكر الله. Ibn Kathir rahimahullah ta'ala said the Quran should be protected and respected from being recited in the musical maqamat. Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali said the majority of the ulama don't allow this musical maqamat, and some related an ijma' on that. And he spoke strongly against it. So did many other ulama. Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad, Muhammad ibn Sirin, Al-Nawawi, Al-Qurtubi, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala said it's not permissible for the Quran to be recited in the musical tones. And I told you, pay attention to the definition of what al-maqamat al-musiqiyya are. Ibn Taymiyyah said it's not permissible to combine to the Quran rhythms that are combined to music. It's comparing the Quran to the music. When I was a child in Medina with my father memorizing the Quran, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give him a long life full of deeds and heal him and cure him. My father took me many times to a very famous sheikh. His name was Sheikh Abdul Fattah ibn Sayyid Ajami al-Marsafi. He was a teacher in the University of Medina. He had several other big positions. He was a contemporary giant and imam in the sciences of the Quran and the qira'at. He said reciting the Quran with those musical maqamat is not permissible in any way, even if it doesn't conflict with the rules of tajweed. He stated that reciting the Quran with the musical maqamat doesn't and cannot coincide with the rules of tajweed. He said the Muslimin have an ijma' on following the rules of the Quran and on the prohibition of the maqamat, and I consider that haram as well. One thing that needs to be noted is that there's some reciters who strongly objected to the musical maqamat being applied to the Quran, and they refused under pressure to learn or recite the Quran in those musical maqamat. They naturally beautify their voices, and at times the recitation may spontaneously correspond with the patterns of some of the maqamat when it wasn't intended. So some use that to claim legitimacy for the recitation in the maqamat, but it occurred spontaneously. That's different than those who learn it and are trained in it